Outburst, a Todd Mills Mystery, Book 4. Author, R.D. Zimmerman. Publisher, Scribble Pub, Minneapolis, Minnesota, 1998. Narrator, Eric Ost. Chapter 12. The rest of their dinner was kind of a disaster. In fact, Todd stayed barely another 5 minutes at Cafe Bobino. "I've got to get back to work," he said, excusing himself. "Like I don't. It's probably impossible, but among 100 other things, I've got to see if I can get a trace on that call," said Rollins. "Come on, Todd, sit back down. We could eat and be out of here in 10 minutes. "No, I'll just grab a sandwich from the machine at the station." Janice took a sip of wine, then quipped, "Frankly, I prefer risotto to plastic." "I'm sorry," continued Todd. "I've just got to get back and figure out what I'm going to do for the 10 o'clock. Janice put down her glass. "So, what are you going to do?" "I don't know," said Todd, shifting in his seat, because, after all, he didn't like lying, particularly not to the two most important people in his life. A phone call like that kind of changes everything we had planned. "No shit," Rollins shook his head. "I don't like this." "Neither do I," seconded Janice. "There are a lot of nuts out there, most of whom I come across on a daily basis in court. This guy, obviously, really dangerous. He's already killed a cop, you know." Todd looked at Janice, then Rollins. The two of them were staring at him, pressing him to reveal how he might handle this. He had an inkling, more than one actually, but he couldn't tell them, or at least not Rollins. At first, just after the call, he was frightened, even shaken. Then, however, it started kicking in, that old sense, the one that pushed him to ask question after question, and that caused him to hound a victim, to follow a drug dealer, to tail a judge until he had the complete answer to a complex question. And this time, he'd succeeded, at least so far, for he'd brought things more or less into the open. He'd poked at the story of the murder of Mark Forrest, and the killer had bitten back. Yes, the man who'd shot Forrest had peeped out of his hole. So what would Todd's next move in fact be? He looked directly into Rollins's dark eyes, which were staring right back at his, but it wasn't Rollins, his lover, studying him with worry. No, it was Rollins, the homicide investigator, and this, once again, boiled down to freedom of the media. No, Todd couldn't reveal his thoughts because, of course, what Todd was thinking of doing would piss off Rollins every bit as much as it would the killer. Todd pushed back his chair, rose, then leaned over and kissed Janice on the cheek and said, "I'll talk to you tomorrow." "Take care, sweetheart." "Rollins," began Todd, wanting to at least hug the other man. I guess I won't see you tonight, so just don't do anything stupid." "I won't?" "I wish I could count on that." Rollins shook his head as he fiddled with his napkin. "Have I ever told you how often people like you fuck up a case by reporting the wrong things at the wrong time?" "Repeatedly," Todd glared at him. "Have I ever told you it's best if you do your job and I do mine?" Yeah, mumbled Rollins, now staring at his glass of wine. "I'll be watching at 10. "That sounds like a threat." Rollins shrugged, but said nothing. "Well, screw you," thought Todd, forgetting about the hug as he stormed away. He didn't have time for this. Not now, not tonight. The police hadn't succeeded in establishing some sort of contact with Mark Forrest's murderer. He had. And that murderer hadn't contacted Rollins or anyone else at the Minneapolis Police Department. No, he'd called Todd directly, so this was his baby. Todd's and his alone. He had to keep at it too. Not let it go. This was going to make for news. Big news. Hot news of that. Todd would make sure. The frustration clearly smoldering on his face, Todd made his way through the tables and chairs, down the side hallway, and past the bleach-haired host, who stood next to his stand, clutching a stack of menus. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Mills?" "Unfortunately," Todd managed to reply. He pushed out the door and burst into the hot, thick summer air. Where the hell, he thought, looking up and down the street, was his car? Down toward the river, a huge swarm of bugs swirled in the orangish glow of a streetlight. And there, beneath all that, stood his dark green Cherokee. He knew all too well that no relationship was easy, not by any means. Up to this point, he had in fact screwed up. No, ruined virtually every one he'd been in. Starting with Janice, so long ago, then moving to Trish, his ex-wife, and next, Michael. Todd had managed not only to make every mistake possible, but to hurt every person he'd been involved with. Okay, so with Janice it had been more or less a mutual error, for they'd both been mired in the muck of sexual orientation and flailing about for answers. He'd married Trish, however, out of desperation, not only hoping he loved her, but determined to prove something, specifically that he wasn't gay after all. As if using her hadn't been bad enough, Todd then went on to Michael, giving himself sexually to him, yet never fully emotionally, which in its own way had killed that relationship as well. And now Rollins. "Damn it," he cursed aloud. Todd stopped, grabbed onto a parking meter with one hand, put the other to his forehead, and took a deep breath. More than one person had called him selfish. A great many had labeled him self-centered. So what was he supposed to do here? Do a job that he was not only paid handsomely for, but that he was great at? A job that came to him as naturally as breathing, and that he craved just as dearly? Or was he supposed to succumb to the wishes of the person he loved more than anyone or anything else? Wait, it was Rollins the cop, not Rollins the lover, who wanted Todd to step back and turn this whole thing over to the police, right? Notwithstanding that there had been no visible homosexual role models when he was young, Todd just didn't know how you did this same-sex relationship thing. Two guys most often meant two careers, as well as two healthy egos, which was quite clearly the case with Rollins and him. In a straight relationship, it started, unfortunately, with sexual definition. Who was the man and who was the woman? While in a gay relationship, it was often defined in sexual parlance. Who was top and who was bottom? And that highlighted the lack of difference between a straight and a gay relationship, because in the end, it all came down to dominance, which in fact was the major struggle between Todd and Rollins. The career stuff was an especially huge issue, one that they'd never discussed, but that played itself out almost daily, as the detective who sought justice and the reporter who sought truth struggled to establish who and which was more important. Somewhat surprisingly, Todd was only just coming to the realization that the world didn't spin according to him. For so long, he'd fought his sexuality, did everything he could to deny it, to prove he wasn't a fag, and therefore a despicable deviant and an incompetent ninny, unworthy of love, a fairy who couldn't do anything but swish about. Ever since he could remember, he battled all his self-hatred by becoming the best goddamn investigative reporter there was, fighting to prove his worth to others as if his life depended on it, which he believed it had, and going at it so obsessively that he now had trouble stepping back to further complicate things. Todd had learned by example, that of his father, the Polish immigrant, who demanded support and nurturing but never returned it to his partner, his unwavering wife. Todd's mother, yes, rightly or wrongly, Todd had adopted this most guy of characteristics, following in his father's footsteps, always taking more than giving, and never had Todd been so fully and absolutely challenged as he had been not only by Rollins, but in particular by Rollins' health status, which meant that for the first time in his life, Todd found himself in the position of wanting to give more than get. Todd heard steps behind him and quickly turned, hoping more than anything that it was him, Rollins. It took but a mere second for Todd to fantasize Rollins rushing out, the two of them embracing. Todd pulling the shorter but thicker and stronger man into his arms. Instead of the chance to take this all back to square one, however, Todd saw not Rollins but some other man. A tall, skinny guy with a cigarette perched between his lips, hurrying down the sidewalk. So, what should Todd do? Go back, he told himself. He should just return to the restaurant, apologize, tell Rollins how much he loved him, that this was a blip, nothing more. That Todd was just trying to do his job, that he'd do just as Rollins wanted, whatever that might be. That he took a step back toward Babino's at the same instant, glancing at his watch. Shit, he muttered to himself, stopping just as quickly. He had a job to do, and all of this was first and foremost about work, and if in light of the mysterious call from the killer, Todd was now going to change what he was going to say on the 10 p.m. news, if he was going to come at this thing from a different angle, then he'd better hightail it out to WLAK right this second. Time was of the essence, absolutely, he thought, turning around and again heading for his vehicle. After all, later on there'd be plenty of time to sort through all this with Rollins, right? Everyone at WLAK received the news of the threat against Todd as if it were the best of Christmas presents. This is too great, exclaimed Craig, the late news producer, a young guy with light hair, big glasses, and a permanent smile affixed to his face as he paced back and forth in Todd's small office. I mean, not only are you in WLAK and all the newspapers, but now you're part of the story. This is so cool. Glad you think so, Todd muttered, seated in front of his computer and seeing the perversity of all this more clearly than ever. I mean, the killer really called you? A scout's honor. This is just going to keep the whole thing right on the front burner. The viewers are going to love this. I mean, you're a potential victim. You realize that, don't you, Todd? Yes, thank you very much, Todd was reluctant to add. And there's one more thing. Mark Forrest was gay. It was like throwing gas on an open fire, and Craig said, Oh, this is so unbelievably hot. This is so perfect. Man, oh man, what a story. Todd's journalistic instincts, which ran so completely opposite to Rollins' procedures, were precisely the ones Craig wanted to go with. And for good reason. Todd's broadcast tonight at 10 o'clock would not only keep viewers glued to WLAK, but would undoubtedly be reported in tomorrow's papers. What great publicity. Channel 10, right there at the front. But how actually to do it? A year ago, perhaps even a mere 6 months back, Todd would have played it all for the sizzle, for the paramount effect. Namely, for the ratings, and what impact that would bear upon investigative reporter Todd Mills and his career. But now perhaps he wasn't so much smarter as he was a tad bit wiser. Yes, he had to report on this latest development, but he had to do it just right. Instead of a cotton candy-like buzz, he was determined to provide something of lasting value. Todd wrote the script as he saw fit. Craig read it, grimaced, and wanted more jazz, more sparks. Todd refused. Listen, if I can't do it the way I see fit, he calmly said, then I'll have to skip the 10 p.m. And... What? Craig shrieked without losing his ubiquitous smile. You can't do that. Of course I can. I'll just leave now. Think about it overnight, and then perhaps do the story tomorrow. No fucking way. Management will have a shit fit, you know? Craig pulled at his hair, paced one step, then froze. Wait a minute. You're blackmailing me, aren't you? What kind of person do you think I am? Sick. Very sick. I'll get someone else to do it. It won't work. I was the one who spoke to the killer. Nobody can do this report but me. Jesus Christ, Todd! Of course, Todd was blackmailing him, refusing to go on at 10 and declining to do the report until tomorrow would give all the credit, not to Craig, the night producer, but to tomorrow morning's producer. Okay, I give, said Craig, surrendering and rubbing his sinuses at the top of his nose. You just better be great. Aren't I always? The next decision was to not send Todd back to the Stone Arch Bridge, where they had planned for him to do a live report in the darkness of the night. Rather, the decision was made for Todd to broadcast right there from Studio A at WLAK. A minute before the top of the hour, Todd seated himself at the news desk, joining Channel 10's latest discovery of the late-night anchor, Martin Stewart. A tall, slender Native American with silky black hair and a chiseled face. Todd fitted the clear earpiece into his ear, and then nodded a greeting to Martin, who returned it with a savvy smile. Yes, they both knew what was up, that in large part they had their jobs because they were the perfect tokens. The Indian who could dress like a white man, and the fag who could carry himself like a straight guy. Okay, came the line producer's voice via IFB transmission into both Todd's and Martin's earpieces. With 30 seconds in front, a few minutes later, the distant news director seated somewhere out there at his computerized panel began the countdown, his godly voice cooing into Todd's ear and head. 10, 9, 8, 7. Precisely on cue, the anchor looked directly into the robotic camera that floated just a few feet in front of him and said, "Welcome to WLAK's 10 at 10 report. I'm Martin Stewart. Our top story tonight continues to be that of the murder of Minneapolis Park Police Officer Mark Forrest, which has unfolded this evening with a shocking new development. The story began last night at approximately 7:30, just as torrential rains and 100-mile-an-hour straight-line winds were striking the Twin Cities area. WLAK's investigative reporter, Todd Mills, was following up on a lead which had taken him to the Stone Arch Bridge in downtown Minneapolis when he witnessed the shooting of Forrest. The body apparently tumbled from the bridge and was not located until late this morning, when Mills and a homicide investigator discovered the body downstream in the Mississippi River. In what could be the strangest twist to this story, however, now comes the report that Todd Mills has received a phone call from a man who claims to have pulled the trigger of the gun that killed Sergeant Forrest. Tossing it to Todd, he said, "Here to report is Todd Mills." Like the naggiest of moms, Craig's voice cut into Todd's earpiece. "Okay, Todd, milk it. Be real sincere. I want viewers crying." The second camera, controlled by the news director via computer, zeroed in on Todd, and the light atop it flashed red. Just at that moment, the floor director pointed directly at Todd, indicating he was live. "Oh, brother," thought Todd, realizing what he was about to do. This was like reaching into a hornet's nest and smacking about. No doubt about it, this was going to turn things into a hell of a brew. The murder of Officer Mark Forrest has been both odd and mysterious, began Todd, his voice deep and even. No motive for the shooting has yet to be identified, nor has any suspect. However, Park police officials this afternoon stated that Officer Forrest was gay and completely open about this aspect of his life with his family and friends and co-workers. Just what bearing this might have or might not have on the case is not yet known. But police will be studying this information to see if there's any kind of link to the murder of a gay man just last month. Additionally, several hours ago, I received an anonymous telephone call from a man who claimed to have shot Officer Forrest. In no uncertain terms, he stated his frustration and anger at me for speaking earlier of his personality. Go ahead, thought Todd, his eyes following the teleprompter. Just read it. In the course of the brief conversation, I was not able to give my reply, which I will do in just a moment. Craig's voice chirped. Beautiful, Todd, beautiful. Struggling not to trip up while someone was babbling away in his ear, Todd kept his eyes on the text and continued to read. First, however, let me go back over the story step by step. They cut once again to the package, only slightly modified for the late news. With Todd doing a voiceover, the tape proceeded first showing scenes from the storm, then the spot where the shooting had taken place, and next the Police and Bureau of Investigation boys scouring the area late last night. The footage continued, showing the police earlier today pulling the mutilated body out of the river and the medical examiner carting it away. Because, of course, it was important to the station as well as to the security of his own job. Todd didn't just toot his own horn. He blew it like any other reporter would, without hesitation, describing how frustrated the police had been both late last night and again this morning. Todd, however, hadn't a quest, for he was certain of what he'd witnessed, rather with the help of one particularly dutiful investigator, whom Todd didn't mention by name, because he wasn't certain what Rollins would want. Todd had continued the hunt for the truth, eventually locating the body of Officer Forrest nearly a mile downstream from the Stone Arch Bridge. When the tape footage concluded, the camera in front of him again went live, and Todd, staring directly into the lens, continued reading the teleprompter, saying, "As of this moment, the authorities have no suspects in custody, nor do they know of any motive for this heinous act. But, as I mentioned earlier, several hours ago, I received an anonymous and mysterious phone call from a man who identified himself as the killer of young Officer Forrest. I was rather doubtful at first, wondering if it wasn't some sort of crank call, but eventually I was convinced of the veracity of his identity. The caller then lambasted me for not just sticking to the facts, threatened me personally, and hung up. Let me now say that I, as well as the police, have every reason to believe that you, the killer, lured me to the scene of the crime in an attempt to get maximum television exposure, and since I also have every reason to believe that you, the person who so cowardly gunned down a young off-duty policeman, are now watching this broadcast, here is my reply." Out of nowhere came Craig's voice. "Bravo!" His brow creased with anger, as if he were staring not into a camera, but into the eyes of a killer. Todd said, "Neither I nor WLAK will be used. You have committed a terrible crime, and I will not, I repeat, will not glorify your disgusting act of murder. In other words, this is not a game, and I will not play along. At least," thought Todd, "not according to your rules. At this time, I urge you to turn yourself in to the authorities." Todd then turned to the late-night anchor and tossed it to him, saying, "Martin, at this point, I have nothing further to add." Martin stammered ever so slightly, then said, "Todd, thank you very much for that most interesting report." The light atop the camera aimed at Todd flashed off, and then Todd took off his earpiece and slipped away from the news desk. As 10 at 10 continued and Todd made his way through the dark studio, he couldn't help but smile. That, he knew with blustery and smug confidence, was TV at its best. Both sizzle and substance. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.